ask you for a no vote.
Mr. Wagner, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Virtually everyone who has spoken on the floor today on this bill has suggested, very rightly, this is a very difficult bill, that the step we are taking here, if in fact we take it, is in fact a very, very hard step for some very, very sad cases. Certainly, everyone on this floor, whether they've spoken or not, has or will, if they've been fortunate enough so far not to, has had some experience with this. The question we face is, do we take this hard first step? I don't often quote scripture on this floor. In fact, I may never have. And I'll keep that record alive. I'll paraphrase Deuteronomy. I shall set before you life and death, and you shall choose life. Why? It's precisely to address this hard first step. Because, friends, if we take this hard first step, the next step's a little bit easier. Frankly, there's no limiting principle once we take this step. The next step is a little bit easier, and the second and third and fourth steps down this path become easier still. That's not a hypothetical concern. My friend from Bakersfield just explained what we see in Oregon. Not a lot of data in from Oregon, but there is some, and it's troubling. Dignity Health, which owns 33 hospitals here in California, submitted an opposition letter, and they referenced the Oregon case that Ms. Grove talked about. It is chilling. There are two patients, Beverly Wagner, no relation, and Mr. Stroop, who was mentioned before, who were denied chemotherapy because that's expensive. And my friend from San Diego, speaking on health care, hit that nail squarely on the head. That's expensive. They were, however, offered a $100 pill as treatment. That's not treatment. That's maybe the easy way out after the hard step has already been taken. And we go even farther. We've seen in the Netherlands, they've had physician-assisted suicide for years, well beyond what even Oregon has done. And there, it is permissible to end the life of I don't know what the Norwegian word is. It's translated as defective child. They didn't start there. They probably started where we're starting today. But they got there because they took the first hard step, and then the second somewhat easier step, and the third easier step after that. We're told it's about compassion. I can't possibly rival our good friend from San Diego, who often quotes poets on this floor to us. But I'll give you a snippet of Dylan Thomas. Do not go gently into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. That's compassion. Fighting for life, fighting for quality of life, fighting for medical care to provide the quality of life. That is the direction we should be going, not these initial steps in the other direction. But wait, lots of our constituents like it. It's going to go on the ballot. Let's do the work for our constituents. No. If the public wants to vote for this, let them. Let the arguments be made in the court of public opinion. Let the vote be taken. Let this go into law on the ballot, where we can't very easily take that next and the following steps.
30 seconds.
Best case scenario, vote this down, and that ballot measure does not pass because we must fight for life. But at a minimum, give your constituents the right to say, this is what we want, and this is the limit to how far we will go, so that we in future years or those who succeed us cannot take those next couple of steps because we've seen wherever this is tried, they always do that. Let's not go down that path. Vote no. It's a tough vote. Tough cases, but vote no.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. Mr. Hadley, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many of you, like my colleague from Carson, I'm very torn about this bill. I fully understand and in many ways share the desire that is so natural to have control, to have dignity, to have a death of one's choice in the same way that we hope to live our life pursuant to our own choices. It's a very powerful human emotion, and I certainly share it. And I understand the desire of so many Californians for that. Like I suspect all of you, I've been getting plenty of feedback on this bill. Many of you have been far more eloquent than I on that point. I really want to make two related points. This body has not done much of the very important work that we need to do around end of life more generally. The Institute of Medicine has called the training and education of our medical students, our residents, woefully inadequate on end-of-life challenges, the difficult conversations that are not only hard for families but are hard for medical professionals. This bill, if law, will grant significant power to physicians that they're not medically equipped to exercise today. We have done a poor job around palliative care, around hospice care. There are many issues of state policy that affect how we die, and this is not the only one. For example, you preclude certain medical care options when you choose the route of hospice that you don't preclude by seeking a prescription for a pill like this. Whether this bill passes or not, we owe it to our constituents, we owe it to the state of California to improve end-of-life care for all Californians who don't choose this route, and will be the vast majority of all Californians, no matter what this House does. We cannot ignore the procedural aspects of this bill. I voted to override the chair's judgment as to whether this bill is in order. And, Mr. Chairman, may I have permission to read?
Without objection, Mr. Holden, you are recognized.
The issue of this bill being before the body has been determined by the chair and been voted on. I ask that the speaker stay focused on the issues and not drift back into that subject matter.
That's in the form of a parliamentary inquiry. If that is a point of order, Mr. Holden, that point of order is well taken. Mr. Hadley, you may continue with regard to the merits of this bill, not the decision of the chair, which has been determined by this body.
The governor's proclamation that convened this session in which we're now deliberating this bill asked us to consider and act upon legislation necessary to, A, establish mechanisms so that any additional rate increases expand access to services. I will.
Mr. Holden, for what purpose?
Respectfully, Mr. Chair, I raise the same objection that the issue and the merits that he's arguing are to the merit of whether or not we should be in this extraordinary session dealing with the subject before us. It has been ruled on, and so I ask that we ask the Speaker to stay focused on the merits and not on the rationale of this issue being dealt in extraordinary session.
Mr. Holden, that point of order is well taken. Mr. Hadley, I urge you. Mr. Jones, state your point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would appeal the decision of the chair and ask that the body vote on the decision.
Mr. Jones is objecting to the immediate ruling by the chair with regard to Mr. Holden's point of order. If Mr. Jones is appealing the decision of the chair, Mr. Jones, you have 2 minutes to present information. That requires a second, however, on the appeal. That is seconded by Mr. Wilk. Mr. Jones, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to say to the body that I'm very impressed with the level of debate over this bill this morning. As this is a very weighty measure, I think that it does deserve the attention that it's receiving from speakers on both sides of the issue. Mr. Speaker, I don't envy your position this morning having to keep control of the House over this issue. I don't envy your position in having to make decisions of decorum and order in ruling points of order this morning over this deliberation. But, Mr. Speaker, I do have to raise an objection to your previous two rulings, actually. In Mr. Hadley speaking to this bill specifically, AB 15, I believe is what we're calling it this morning. In the second extraordinary session, I believe Mr. Hadley was in the process of reading the governor's declaration of why he called this second extraordinary session. I believe that that is very germane to the bill. It's very germane to the process that we're undertaking right now at this point. And I would also ask the body to allow Mr. Hadley to finish reading the declaration from the governor regarding the second extraordinary session, because that is specifically what he was speaking to. Now, the body, through bypassing the traditional committee hearing process on this bill, has decided to allow this bill to come to the floor during the second extraordinary session. So I believe that allows Mr. Hadley the right and the ability and the time to read the declaration of the second extraordinary session. And, Mr. Speaker, I would ask specifically of you that if there are any other further interruptions of Mr. Hadley's reading of that declaration, that you would rule not well taken. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. What you're appealing, Mr. Jones, is my determination that Mr. Holden's point of order was point well taken, that Mr. Hadley stick to the merits of the measure before us. You referred to the prior appeal, and I've already ruled on that appeal. So the decision before us is, should the ruling of the chair be upheld with regard to my most recent ruling on Mr. Holden's point of order? Members, this is procedural. The clerk will open the roll. Mr. Holden is asking for an aye vote, that the decision of the chair be upheld. Mr. Jones is asking for a no vote. Mr. Holden is asking for an aye vote. And Mr. Jones is asking for a no vote. This is on the appeal, the decision of the chair. Majority of those present and voting. Clerk will close the roll. Ayes 40, noes 28. Majority of those present and voting concurring that the decision of the chair be upheld. Mr. Hadley, you may proceed with all of these rulings in mind. There is a minute 23, Mr. Hadley, on your time.
Thank you. The actions of this body in this extraordinary session to make this important decision, I personally don't believe that this is the right time to make this decision. I will accept the ruling of the chair. I don't believe it's possible that either the Rules Committee or the chair or even a majority of this chamber can overrule the express wording of the governor's proclamation for this special committee. This is an incredibly difficult bill for me and for many of us. I'm not the point I was going to get to, which is ironic that I was shut down on this point. The point that I was going to get to was that notwithstanding my procedural objections, we have an important bill before us. It's upon all of us to vote our conscience, and I thank all of you for this debate.
Thank you, Mr. Hadley. Mr. Gomez, you are recognized.
Members, this is a bill that I've been giving a lot of thought. I am on the regular Health Committee, and there could be some debate on if this was appropriate, but either way, this is where we're at, right? This is the decision that is before us. When I was looking at this bill, I tried to look at the entirety of a person's life, from the beginning to the end. And I struggled with certain facts. That one thing is that healthcare in our country is definitely not created equal. And that the disparities range from neighborhood to neighborhood, city to city, from one region to the next, from one population to the next. If you're a minority, if you're not, if you're an immigrant, if you're not, if you're LGBT or straight, your health outcomes have often been predetermined just by simply who you were born. So we know for a fact that people without health insurance have worse outcomes when it comes to health care. And this is one of the things that I struggled with, that I've witnessed, is that individuals who are of a minority background are more likely to end up in this situation facing a terminal illness. You know, the statistics show that African American women will more likely die of breast cancer when there is actually a higher incidence among white women. Why is that? Because minorities are less likely to have health insurance, less likely to get preventative care, less likely to be diagnosed in an earlier stage than non-minorities. And this is kind of a situation that I faced growing up because I had no health insurance until I was almost 25 years old. I witnessed this with my father who died of pancreatic cancer, and I was there from the diagnosis to the doctor not being able to really tell him that he only had a few months to live, and that ended up being my responsibility. So I've seen this play out. But one of the things that I've always understood is that we have to try to relieve people's suffering throughout their life. And I like how people pick and choose where we relieve that suffering. You know, some people will speak against this bill because we don't do enough for an individual through health care. But then when they have an opportunity to vote to expand health care, they don't vote for it. When they have an opportunity to actually provide access, they don't vote for it. So for me, it's a struggle when it comes to some of the hypocrisy that I'm hearing on both sides of these arguments. It's definitely a struggle. I got into this in order to see how we can relieve people's suffering from the beginning, and understanding that a person's life is not determined by the bookends from the beginning and their death, but everything in between. And that's what I've been working on, trying to expand healthcare for everyone so that they wouldn't feel like they have no option at the end of their life. However, we're still at this scenario of what do you do when someone has that diagnosis and is suffering. And this is something that I have struggled with. And I've come to a conclusion that, and I've been on record that I wasn't going to vote for it in the committee. and that I would give it time to think about. And I actually was hoping that this bill would come up 6 months later, not a few weeks later. But I came to the same conclusion that if my job is to relieve their suffering during the normal course of their life, then it's also my responsibility to give them the option to relieve that suffering at the end of their life.
30
so
seconds.
I ask, and I will vote for this bill today because of some of the amendments that were taken in the interim that I believe that improve this bill, but also to make sure that people, although our system isn't perfect, that they do have the option to relieve their suffering at the end of their life.
Thank you, Ms. Gomez. Mr. Chavez, you are recognized.
Well, I really appreciate the discussion, and probably one of the best we've had here in some time, and it deserves it. And considering the fact that when this vote goes through, it's not going to be a Republican-Democrat vote, it's going to be a lot of us voting our conscience and how we feel. The reason I'm standing is I'm actually going to use a different argument. I listened closely to everybody talking about cost of medicine, needs of community, minority communities, choice, self-determination. That's not where I'm going with this. I would like to step back a little bit more and think about this whole issue of life itself. You know, there was a time about the 1600s, the metaphysical poets, there was a poet named John Donne. He wrote a poem that said, "Death be not proud." And they were struggling about the issue of how is a person going to die and the pain that you go through until you die. What's happened recently in the past, in my lifetime, is that technology has changed the whole way we look at life. When I was a young kid, if you had sex, you're probably going to have a child. But because of medicine, we were able to change that. And what we've seen now is that before, when young people would get married at 17 or 18 or 19, people are getting married in their 30s because they have a choice to begin what was said earlier, when does life begin? We were able to change that. And now as we live through life, through changes in medication, you know, just recently heard where they actually developed a heart through a new procedure. Take material from a person's heart and built them a new heart that they could use, which before was unheard of. A lot of us know people who have had knees replaced with the metal knees. Now they can actually grow you a new knee. We are coming to really what Huxley talked about in 1930 of a brave new world. In a world that doesn't sanctify, respect, and mystified and love life, but actually a society that believes that we could control life. And we decide when we come in and when we go out and how we live. You know, members, this isn't just about choice in California and Medicare. This is a more substantive issue about what sort of society we are living in. There are certain things that I believe are a level above us, and that is the sanctity of life. I'd ask you to vote no on this bill.
Thank you, Ms. Chavez. Ms. Baker, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill today. After listening to the great debate and conversations on this floor, as well as speaking with constituents for months, not just during the special session, but for months about this bill. Constituents on both sides of the issue. Constituents who included faith leaders of all manner of faiths in my district, doctors, nurses, hospice care providers, and constituents like Brittany Menard's family, who live in my district, whom she would have been a constituent. And they shared stories with me as well. We've heard a lot of them today. We all know them. But I think they do bear on my decision to support this bill, and I think they bear repeating. Certainly, we learned that Tiffany Menard had a tumor that was immune to palliative care. But I also know of a constituent of mine in Walnut Creek who shared with me the experience of her mother. Permission to read, Mr. Speaker?
Without objection.
Who had breast cancer and for whom palliative chemo had no effect. And she explained how in her final days the tumor erupted through the skin in her back and kept growing. That she was in incredible suffering. That the tumor hurt and oozed and stank. And that she wanted the suffering to end. I also know of my own cousins and my aunts who were given 6 months to live and lived for a couple more years. Good life with our family. And I know of my own chief of staff, for whom I care a lot, who at age 17 watched her father painfully die of pancreatic cancer over 3 weeks, begging for relief from pain when palliative sedation did not work. And the only option each of these folks were left with was slow starvation, drowning in their own fluid, or suffocating. This bill, to me, is not a bill that we're voting on whether or not someone with Alzheimer's can request this prescription. That is not this bill. This bill is not about someone who is depressed or had a bad diagnosis or even has a terrible illness that is not terminal requesting the prescription. This bill does not do that. This bill is about those who are in the final days and hours of their life. They are going to die, and whether or not they will die painfully, suffocating, drowning, starving, or will they die with a peaceful, safe option? And I find that completely compelling. I, as a Christian, do not pretend to know what God has in mind for all of us, why there is pain or suffering in this world, but I do know He is a merciful God. And we have the ability to allow others to have a choice. And if you disagree with that choice, then take every platform you have, every method of communication you have, and persuade others not to take it. But I believe it is cruel, nothing short of cruel, to deny them that choice in their final hours and final days. And so I support this bill. I also support it because in speaking with every faith leader I could in my community, even if they opposed this legislation, and not all of them did, but even if they opposed it, they pointed out to me, and these are leaders who are often in that final moments of life with their parishioners, that this happens all the time. People are slipped medication to kill them all the time, and it is completely unregulated with no safeguards. And we have an opportunity not only to provide a choice that we can disagree with and argue fervently against, but a choice for someone who is in their final painful hours that is safer and well-regulated and has a protection for human life and dignity. And I believe that's why I'm voting for this bill. And I urge my colleagues to not force others to go through that pain, to allow them to make that choice with the safeguards that are in this bill. I didn't originally support this bill for the last several months. It, to me, did not have enough protections for once the person obtained the prescription.
30 seconds.
And I believe now it does. Every amendment has made this bill so much better than Oregon's bill. This is one that I believe recognizes the sanctity of life. And it doesn't mean that a single person who's diagnosed with 6 months to live has to take it, and that they are forced or coerced in any way to end their life. It provides a choice, a compassionate choice, and I urge your aye vote.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Mr. Mathis, you are recognized.
Members, I rise today simply in the memory of my grandmother. She was diagnosed with cancer when I was very young, was given, I can't even remember, it was 4 or 6 months to live. She lived another 10 years. I couldn't imagine my life without her influence and her guidance and her being there. I urge a no vote so that way others may have those memories as well.